Hello everyone, we're today at Essex Farm Cemetery, which also has the very popular John McCrae site. We're about halfway between Boezingen and Ypres. Boezingen is at the northern end of the Ypres Salient and right in the front line. So here we're within the salient area, some distance away from the front line. So by entering the cemetery here, we leave Belgium and we enter British Commonwealth land. These lands were donated by the Belgian government, so these boys could be buried in home soil. Every cemetery or memorial has one of these registers, memorial registers, where visitors can leave a personal message. There are almost 1,200 casualties commemorated on this site, which makes it a relatively small cemetery if you compare, for instance, with the 12,000 in Tynecott. On their headstones, you can find their names, a cap badge, their division, their age at the moment of death, their date of death, as well as a quote that was selected by their families. And some of these can be quite moving. But over 100 were unidentified and they were in unmarked graves. The burials here were made without a definite plan, and some divisions which occupied this sector are found in almost every part of the cemetery. The name Essex Farm refers to a farm that used to be north of here and that reminded some of farms back home in Essex. I guess that was a way to cope with homesickness. The land south of this farm came into use as a dressing station and a cemetery in April 1915, and many of the casualties of the first gas attack and the following Second Battle of Ypres were brought here. Unfortunately, of course, some were buried here as well. You can see here from the irregular layout that the cemetery developed during the war, especially then the first part of it. It's not as perfectly laid out with the parallel rows with headstones equal distance because these men were buried here during the war, often after they had been brought here to the dressing station. After the war, individual graves or graves on smaller cemeteries were brought here, but they're on the far side of the cemetery. You can see there the memorial stone, which is also an element that all the British Commonwealth cemeteries have together with the cross of sacrifice. Now you might notice here that there's some artificial grass mats used, and that is because the most visited grave of the cemetery, and perhaps even of all of Flanders Fields, is Valentine Joe Strudwick. He was one of the youngest battle casualties of the conflict. He was only 14 when he signed up. He lied about his age, of course. Only a short while after he arrived to Flanders, his best friends got killed and he also got injured in a gas attack. After recovering in England, he came back here and he was killed here on January the 14th, 1916, 1 month short of his 16th birthday on Valentine's Day. See those headstones there all together? It means that the men there were buried all together because it couldn't be determined which remains belonged to who. Probably because they were killed in the same explosion. I want to show you one more grave before we go to the John McCrae site and the dressing station, and it's the grave of Thomas Barrett. He was awarded the Victoria Cross, which is the highest decoration of the British honor system. His citation reads, "For most conspicuous bravery, when as a scout he worked his way towards the enemy line several times with the greatest gallantry and determination, in spite of continuous fire from hostile snipers and machine guns at close range, who he stalked and killed. His splendid example of coolness and daring was beyond all praise. After safely regaining our lines, he was killed by a shell." We're on the other side now. You have the cemetery there, of course, and on top there, the memorial for the 49th West Riding Division. And you can see this small cobblestone road here going towards the canal Ezer Ypres. That is connecting the city of Ypres with the river Ezer, which of course also played an important part in the front line from the North Sea to the north of Ypres. Remember that the front line here was distance away, on average about 1 to 2 kilometers, and there were several makeshift basic bridges over this canal for troops, reinforcements, supplies to the front line. There was one right here, but this one was the only one where vehicles could cross. So you can imagine that it was also a constant target of German artillery fire. Ambulances brought casualties to the small dressing station that was dug in the embankments of the canal that you can see there. It was there that John McCrae, a Canadian doctor, attended the injured in April 1915 when they started to arrive in great numbers after the first poisonous gas attack and, of course, the following battle, in which the Canadians played a very important role. It was here, after the funeral of a dear friend, while sitting on the back of a field ambulance and watching the wild poppies blowing in the breeze, that John McCrae wrote his famous poem in Flanders Fields. It became the symbol of remembrance for those who died in the service of their country. The name we often use now for these World War I battlefields in Belgium, Flanders Fields, also comes from this poem. So when John McCrae was working here, he was attending the injured in basically all in the embankments. Some straw on the ground, barely any light, and shells exploding nearby. But in 1917, as preparation for the Battle of Passchendaele, planned for the summer, they upgraded many dressing stations in the Ypres Salient, including this one here. So this is how the advanced dressing station looked like from 1917, a huge improvement compared to John McCrae's days. Each of these spaces had a specific function. This one, the first one, was the officers' mess. Now you can see that this side here, the John McCrae side, is especially popular with Canadians for obvious reasons, of course. He was Canadian. It's amazing to think that these bunkers were flooded and completely inaccessible until about 25 years ago when they were acquired by the city of Ypres and they were restored to allow access. The closed one right there was for the walking cases, so those that were injured but could still walk and sit down. They didn't do any surgeries here, they basically just did triage, pain relief, preparing for evacuation. They determined here who was likely to survive and be evacuated and who was likely not to make it, and given pain relief to make their final moments more comfortable. And those were especially here in this area for the stretcher cases. For many men, the space here was the last thing they saw before they died. This narrow space here or the latrines, and just like in toilets nowadays, people have left their marks here. Some of these are actually date back to the war days. And this next space here was the working and the dressing area for the nurses and the doctors. It has these divisions, which likely had some kind of curtains to give some privacy to the nurses or the doctor or the patients, of course, that they were treating here. Next was the kitchen, which I personally can't really envision in this kind of narrow space. And lastly, next to, besides this one, behind a closed door, unfortunately, was where the wounded were prepared and waiting for their evacuation. There was a small bridge here over the waterway out there, and ambulances were waiting. They were parked there. They were then taken further away to, for instance, the casualty clearing station or a field hospital. So we just went up a few steps, and here we see some remnants of a few more constructions, bunkers. The two half-buried bunkers were the cookhouse and the quartermaster's store. There were actually four more right here, offices basically, but they disappeared. Across the water were then the personnel dugouts across that waterway, which of course had a little bridge, as I mentioned before. Were even more bunkers in the wooded area there as well. This place actually has one of the highest concentrations of bunkers. After the war, these bunkers were used by returning refugees. There was nowhere else to seek shelter, and for many, it took months, even a year, before they had any real roof above their heads. And that concludes our visit to Essex Farm and the John McCrae site for today. I'll be uploading more videos of Flanders Fields site soon, but you can already check out the Hill 61. You can subscribe to the channel, of course, if you want to be notified of new World War I videos or other history videos related to Belgium. Thanks for watching.